I'm going to pick up kind of, well, not exactly where Åsa Wikfors left off in the morning, but I will be talking about overlapping issues, getting into some more detail on certain of them. So I'm particularly interested in the role that emotions play in matters of social epistemology and what the implications of that are. There has been much talk about how people increasingly fail to share a common base of empirical beliefs about politically relevant issues, like the causes of reality and reality of climate change, or the causes of racial disparities in various things. This could be because different groups are exposed to different evidence, or it could be because those groups treat the same evidence in different ways. I think this is a distinction that will be relevant. And of course, here in the background is the familiar fact that when it comes to this kind of issues, most of us don't have either competence or access to raw data ourselves, so we have to rely on other people, people who are experts, or at least data that is collected by other people, even if we do our own reasoning about it. So we have to look at kind of issues in social epistemology. And there's two familiar explanations for this kind of doxastic divergence that you find. So one, the simpler explanation is that people are in different epistemic bubbles. That is to say, they are not kind of communication environment in which they're not exposed to the same information or evidence about issues. It could be that because the kind of mass media is polarized, so that some people watch Fox and others watch some other channels. It could be that social media networks become politically polarized, or just because people get fed different content because of algorithms. I think that this sort of divergence certainly explains some things, but it won't explain everything, as is manifest from the fact that merely giving people the same information doesn't mean that they end up with the same beliefs. So the more promising explanation is in terms of what are now commonly called echo chambers, where the idea is that it's not just that people have access to different information or evidence, but they are in some way insulated from certain kinds of evidence, that they distrust certain experts, certain kinds of testimonies from others. So T. Nguyen, for example, says that an echo chamber is an epistemic community which creates a significant disparity in trust between members and non-members. And he also suggests that what's distinctive of echo chambers is that the members either accept, perhaps avow certain set of core beliefs that include beliefs about the trustworthiness of outsiders. I would want to resist a little bit the idea that we are all in an echo chamber, like Neil Levi says in his recent work. One way to resist that is to restrict the kind of beliefs that you have to accept in order to be in an echo chamber, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But of course, if we just take the broad definition, it's true that if you're a scientist, then you are disposed to distrust certain kinds of testimony, for example, by people who are using some sort of fake science, for example. Now, Nguyen, in his influential work, notes that these bubbles can easily form accidentally. You just associate with like-minded people and they share information from certain sources, for example, and not from others. But he suggests that echo chambers are usually deliberately created. And indeed, the sort of models for echo chambers in the scientific literature are things like religious cults or kind of right-wing talk radio, where there's someone who has an agenda who for political reasons wishes to generate distrust in certain sources, often including science. But also Nguyen says that, well, it's not necessary that echo chambers are set up intentionally. What interests me here in particular is how this kind of communities with disparities in trust can form spontaneously, kind of bottom up rather than top down. And I think that that's where emotions have an important role to play. The kind of trust that we're talking about is what we might call testimonial trust, which is something that we need in situations where we're epistemically vulnerable to others. We don't have access to the first-hand data, or we lack the capabilities to understand it. And when we do have testimonial trust, then we trust someone to give correct information, or something that's likely enough to be correct information that bears on the sort of questions that we have, and not to withhold this kind of information that is pertinent to our questions. Without going into any detail about the nature of trust, I think we can say that it involves attributing to the trusted person not just believing that they have these things, but having some sort of affective attitude towards them that also attributes to them these two things, namely right sort of motivation, and maybe also right sort of character, that they're honest, that they're helpful. This aspect we might label moral trust or practical trust perhaps, and also competence on the issues, that they know what they're talking about, or more generally that they live up to epistemic norms, or these sort of truth-oriented norms. So this element I'll call epistemic trust. So testimonial trust involves both of these. Now, how might emotions then affect our testimonial trust in others? Well, when it comes to moral trust, people like Karen Jones have argued that there's a kind of direct sort of influence. So Jones argues, for example, that fear is an emotion that is incompatible with trust, that it at least clashes with trust, and this is in particular moral trust. So if you're afraid of someone, then you don't think that they have goodwill towards you, that they're helpful towards you. And this distrust then further increases fear towards the person. There's a kind of an affective loop. Now, I think this is an interesting kind of view and explains, again, at least some of the phenomena that we're interested in. But I think it doesn't do very much. I think there's not that many emotions that are incompatible with trusting people. Not even anger doesn't seem to play that kind of role. So I think it's more likely that, and more common, that there's kind of indirect influence on epistemic trust in particular. Let's start with the idea of affectively charged propositions. So I think it's uncontroversial that our moral and political views are affectively charged, that we care about things like equality, we're emotionally involved in those things. But it's not obvious, I think, how that charge gets transmitted to empirical propositions, which on the face of it don't have anything to do with our attitudes. Of course, it could be, and I think frequently is the case, that when other people around us care about the truth of certain propositions or falsity of certain propositions, they become affectively charged for us. But still, somehow that whole process has to get started. And I think that the likeliest explanation for that is a kind of affective transmission, where basically people realize that if they want to hold on to the kind of views that they care about, or if they want people to act in ways that they think people should act, then it's very convenient for them if certain empirical facts are true. So, for example, even if you are a sort of free market conservative, you might well agree that what we do causes harm to other people, then government intervention is warranted. That's roughly Mill's harm principle. And it's easy to see that it's an instance of that if our current patterns of production and consumption of goods cause harmful climate change, then government intervention in the market to prevent this is warranted. So then if we suppose that it is true, as many people say, scientists say, that our current patterns of production and consumption of goods do cause harmful climate change, then it follows from the things that we accept that the government intervention is warranted. So if you're resistant to government intervention, then you have to discredit one of these premises. you will be probably pretty much to the same extent that you're opposed to government intervention. This empirical assumption here becomes effectively charged for you. You want it to be false that our current patterns of production and consumption of goods cause harmful climate change. So I call that the negation of that convenient proposition for someone who has these attitudes. The mere fact that it would be convenient for you if something were true, of course, doesn't get you to believe that it's true. That's not how believing works. Believing purports to represent the world as it is, regardless of what we want. And that's where this notion of motivated reasoning that Wigforss mentioned earlier today comes into the story. I think everyone agrees that there's a sense in which all reasoning is motivated, that maybe we want to find out something about some particular thing because it bears on our practical interests. That is not in any way epistemically problematic, that the reasoning is motivated in that sense. It's just if the process or the conduct of reasoning, or more generally information processing, is influenced by something other than accuracy motivation, the motivation to believe what is true, that's when we get into problems. It's worth noting here that, like, from the inside, our inquiry is always accuracy motivated. We see ourselves as just trying to find out what the truth of the matter is. Otherwise, we wouldn't be engaged in inquiry in the first place. But still, there's a lot of research suggesting, or I would say showing, that our non-cognitive attitudes can affect the way in which we conduct inquiry. For example, confirmation bias, on a narrow definition, refers to a tendency to seek out information that either confirms our prior beliefs. I actually think it's more important that it confirms our desired propositions by way of selective exposure. So you avoid those news sources that give information that contradicts your desired proposition. Prior attitude effect says that the perceived strength of new information is a function of its relationship to the desired proposition. So you give more weight to evidence that supports it, and less weight to evidence that disconfirms it. And finally, there's disconfirmation bias, where you scrutinize arguments and evidence on the other side much more carefully than arguments and evidence on your own side. Now, I mentioned quickly that it's not at all obvious that these are, as such, irrational processes. A lot of people have argued that it's for example, can be very much epistemically rational to, well, it's part of standard Bayesian theory of updating beliefs, that your prior beliefs influence. So if you come to believe something, that the effectively charged proposition is true as a result of something like this kind of motivated reasoning, and then you communicate it to other people who have the same sort of motivations as you, for whom it's also an effectively charged proposition, it is obviously likely that it will resonate with you for the same reason that it resonates with you. They might well buy into it and express agreement with that, which in turn then can even, you could say even rationally, can reinforce your own confidence that they also think this way about that. When people agree with you about things that have come to matter to you emotionally, it's also likely that you have a positive emotional reaction towards them. And that by itself can result in you forming a sense of identity with them. This is something that in the longer version of this talk, I discussed the debate about NATO membership in Finland that we've had this spring. And in that debate, I think we can see this kind of groups forming on the basis of this sort of motivated reasoning on either side of the debate. Once you have a group, either for this reason or perhaps because you share those attitudes to begin with, say skepticism about government intervention or something like that, then it can easily happen that these charged beliefs become elements of that identity. So as Dan Kahane says, policy-relevant facts become symbolically linked to membership in one or another competing cultural group. And that further increases the motivation to have the same belief as your other group members, because if you don't share the beliefs, and in particular if you express disagreement, that might lead to ostracism from a group that has come to be important for your identity, and that's something that we're very strongly motivated to avoid. So far, we have just kind of affectively charged beliefs that result from motivated reasoning that are shared in a group and may be part of an identity. Now, what about trust? I think from this point on, we can move forward in a pretty rational fashion to end up in an echo chamber. So suppose now I have a belief about some matter after I've considered evidence selectively, but without realizing that I'm doing it selectively, and I've discredited evidence speaking on to the other side. Now I encounter somebody who maintains the opposite. That in itself, as long as I don't have some independent reason, and strong enough independent reason to believe that they know better about this topic than I do, can be a reason to change my attitude towards that person. Maybe if I think, well, they wouldn't believe that way if they had the evidence. It's a kind of an epistemic excuse. I just dismiss their view on this occasion. But if I think that they do have the evidence, that they still don't believe this or increase their credence in this proposition, then it's rational for me to reduce epistemic trust in this person. After all, they're getting this important matter wrong. If they believe the opposite or decrease credence faced with the evidence that I think supports the proposition, then that can rationally motivate increase in epistemic distrust in them. Let's go back then to the social context. So suppose that we have, say, A, B, and C who share the belief as a result of this sort of motivated processing, and then another group of people, D, E, and F, who have also been exposed to the relevant evidence but don't share the belief, even though A, B, and C all consider there to be sufficient evidence for that. Now, if they come to know that the A, B, and C come to know that they share this belief and the others don't, in spite of exposure to evidence, then it makes sense for them to increase trust in each other and increase distrust in the outsider group. There's some very interesting work in recent formal epistemology where people do kind of these models that allow for agent-based simulations of what happens in groups when people begin to distrust those who are not, those who don't share their beliefs, and that modeling shows that under this sort of assumptions, this kind of polarization of belief will reliably come about. And of course, this also generates its own kind of epistemic loop, because once you begin to distrust people in the out group and trust people in the in group, in fact, it may be even rational to increase your confidence in beliefs that the in group has and shares. So I think that this sort of epistemic in groups then either they're already echo chambers or they become echo chambers when these kind of social norms form in those groups where basically there's some sort of regime of punishments and maybe rewards within that group for those who share the beliefs and share the trust or distrust. And I suspect, and I'm not going to talk about this now because this is obviously an empirical question, but it seems very likely, given what we know about social media and its structures, that it is something that raises the salience of people's agreement on certain issues, and as well as disagreement of certain other groups, and makes it more likely that these sort of norms are formed. That's kind of entrenching these disparities in trust. Thinking about this sort of spontaneous echo chamber formation also contributes to explaining how these kind of manufactured echo chambers can form. Like if you think of the paradigm example of Rush Limbaugh in the States, this right-wing talk radio host, it's not like people were forced to listen to his, or they didn't have any other options than to listen to his channel. But I think it already drew on this pre-existing emotional resonance, this doubt of the government and elites and whatever. Last, I'm going to consider some implications of this this type of view and perhaps some interventions, although I might not have enough time for it. Okay, so the first and perhaps the only issue I have time to talk about is the rationality question, which, as Professor Wigforss noted in the morning, has become kind of contentious within philosophy. The dominant theory of epistemic rationality under uncertainty, the Bayesian theory of updating, says that people's prior beliefs should influence the way that they update in the face of evidence. And again, many people have shown that if faced with evidence, especially ambiguous evidence, which a lot of evidence is, people can perfectly rationally diverge in their views on issues. And there's no way to tell from merely by looking at data to see when you have divergence that one side is engaged in motivated reasoning and the other one isn't, because they both could get there perfectly by Bayesian updating. So people say, well, these echo chamber beliefs are rational, or some say that they're epistemically faultless, and so on. They're not just practically rational in the kind of sense that it's beneficial somehow to have them, but really epistemically perfectly all right. But I don't believe this, and this is for different reasons than Wigforss. So I think that it doesn't matter that if it's possible that you could end up with the beliefs that you have by some sort of rational updating, as long as a matter of fact your beliefs result from some sort of motivated processing or reasoning, and consequently your distrust in others derives from this sort of motivated reasoning, it will be irrational in virtue of being influenced by these truth-irrelevant factors. There's a couple of different sort of tests that people have proposed for distinguishing from the subject's own perspective which of their beliefs are irrational in this motivated sense and which are not. So Switch-Cable and Ellis. So there's two counterfactual tests. They say that if the justifications, or we might think the evidence, hadn't been available to you, you still would have had at least approximately the same degree of confidence in the proposition on the basis of some other evidence that you would have found for your belief. So if you thought that the Russians are going to attack Finland if it's outside of NATO because of what some Russian politician said 20 years ago, if you hadn't found out about that fact, then you would have found some other reason, like, well, Russia attacked a European neighbor, Finland is a European neighbor, so they will attack Finland. So if that's the case, that shows that your belief is motivated and irrational for that reason. The other counterfactual test is perhaps even simpler, that if you hadn't had the preference, if it hadn't been effectively charged, then you wouldn't have regarded those justifications or evidence as sufficient to support the belief. We could also talk about what I call the hypocrisy test, that if you found out that a member of a competing group has formed their belief, not just in response to truth-relevant factors, but for the factors that, as a matter of fact, explain your own belief, you would regard them as irrational. I think that shows that by your own lights, the belief that you have is not a rational one. Another kind of counterfactual test for this is whether you will form the same. If you had the same evidence on a neutral matter, would you regard that as sufficient to support belief in this? So Cahen's research has some really nice cases where they give basically a data table, and in one case they say this is about how effective a skin lotion is, and in another one, this is about gun control, and people form, depending on their political views, different views on the gun control issue than they do on the skin lotion, even if the data is the same. Even if we say that people who are inside this sort of emotionally constructed echo chamber are irrational, now we shouldn't think that means the same thing as that they're dumb or they're stupid. It's not that sort of criticism. Rationality is not the same thing as intelligent. In fact, a lot of research supports the idea that intelligent people are the very best at rationalizing their beliefs, their irrational beliefs, and making these defensive moves. Also, being irrational is not the same thing as being morally blameworthy for what you believe. You might well have a moral excuse to believe against the evidence. If in your community, in your in-group, it would have serious practical costs to diverge from your peers. And finally, even if somebody is epistemically irrational, so even if you know that this is the case, you can be very confident that they only believe this because they have these background motivations. It's a further question whether you should go and say, well, you're irrational. Because that's this sort of question of how we should respond to something is a practical question. And it needs more reasons than just the epistemic ones to do that. Now, I do think that if somebody's beliefs is irrational in this way, and I'm going to end here, it does follow that you're epistemically blameworthy, or kind of rightly subject to the epistemic analog of blame, which I've argued in past work is roughly speaking a certain kind of epistemic distrust, it doesn't involve moral distrust at all, and it involves kind of downgrading your role in social epistemic practices. So you don't give the same weight to the evidence of someone who you have good reason to believe that they form their beliefs on a subject matter because of non-accuracy motivation. Because this doesn't involve moral blame, I've also argued that the sort of ought implies can conditions are different for these sort of attitudes than for practical ones. It can be true that even if they couldn't have helped it, if they couldn't have avoided it, it might make it wrong to morally blame someone, but not to hold them epistemically accountable. Now, of course, in all this, we have to bear in mind that it is very risky. So there's some interesting work on the bias that suggests that people are very, easily attribute bias to other people and not themselves. So it might well be, you have to watch out that you might be the one who's actually biased and motivated on a particular issue. And also, when you distrust people, when you kind of epistemically punish them, when you find them that they've engaged in motivated reasoning, then you might end up losing out on important evidence because you might be wrong about that, and they might be able to provide it for you. All right, but thanks. That's all I have time for today.